Every single day, roughly 2 billion people eat gluten. It is in bread, pasta, morning cereal, and dozens of foods that rarely trigger a second thought. As those foods travel down into the microscopic environment of the digestive tract, a specific biological process begins. Looking at this breakdown of the global population, the vast majority of those 2 billion people process this protein without incident. But for a specific fraction, somewhere between 6 and 7%, exposure triggers a systemic immune reaction. This immune response often functions without immediate, obvious signals. Millions of people live with this systemic reaction every day, unaware of the microscopic conflict occurring within their own tissues. What we view as a routine dietary habit, an ordinary piece of toast with breakfast, acts as a persistent biological stressor for a significant portion of the population. To understand the origin of this stress, we have to look at the lining of the small intestine. The barrier standing between the food you swallow and your bloodstream is exactly one single layer of cells thick. This animated cross-section shows a healthy gut barrier. Water and nutrients pass through in an orderly sequence, while harmful bacteria and undigested food are blocked. This filtration relies on tight junctions, microscopic seals anchoring the cells together into an unbroken defense line. Our ability to safely extract energy from our environment relies entirely on the continuous structural integrity of this delicate border wall. The system changes when gluten enters this environment. Gluten is a family of storage proteins found in wheat, barley, and rye. The specific molecule researchers study most closely is called gliadin. When gliadin reaches the lining of the small intestine in sensitive individuals, the gut cells respond by releasing a signaling protein known as zonulin. Zonulin functions by binding to the cellular seals between the lining cells. Once triggered, the protein signals those junctions to release their grip. Like loosening the bolts on a dam, zonulin mechanically forces those tight junctions apart. The previously secure barrier is now compromised. The protein does not physically tear through the tissue. It utilizes the body's own communication system to dismantle the primary defense of the small intestine. With the tight junctions open, foreign particles slip through the gaps and enter the bloodstream. This process is known as intestinal permeability. The bloodstream now receives fragments of undigested food and bacterial toxins, molecules that should have been safely excreted. When the immune system encounters these unknown molecules in the blood, it mounts an aggressive defense, triggering a whole-body inflammatory cascade. Over time, this microscopic immune response manifests as systemic symptoms: severe visible bloating, a persistent brain fog, migrating joint discomfort, and a deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to resolve. At the site of the breach, the damage becomes measurable. The tiny, finger-like projections called villi, which absorb vitamins and minerals, begin to flatten and erode. Without functioning villi to pull nutrients from food, the body slowly starves at a cellular level, even while the person continues to eat. What happens to this biological sequence when gluten is removed from the system for 30 days? The immediate response occurs at the gut lining. The cells rebuild, and the microscopic gaps pull back together, sealing the barrier once again. Closing the barrier initiates a repair sequence across the entire system. The microbiome begins to shift, the immune system recalibrates threat levels, and brain chemistry begins to stabilize. This layered biological recovery is a built-in physiological capability, but it is only accessible when the dietary trigger is absent. Research into zonulin actually originated outside the field of gastroenterology. Scientists identified the molecule while investigating the pathology of cholera, one of history's deadliest diseases. We are going to map out how this repair mechanism functions over time. Over the next 20 minutes, we will track the biological changes hour by hour and day by day during 30 days without gluten. The recovery process starts within the first 72 hours with a series of actions that most people do not expect. Welcome to BioState. The journey to physiological repair begins by understanding this biological timeline. Let us begin at hour 0. You have just eaten your last meal containing gluten, perhaps a sandwich on wheat bread or a bowl of pasta. Your digestive system does not know anything has changed yet. Inside the stomach, hydrochloric acid and a powerful enzyme called pepsin begin their work, attempting to break down the protein gliadin. that gliadin resists full digestion. Its molecular structure contains unusually long chains of the amino acids proline and glutamine, which act as a form of biological armor, repelling the enzymes trying to dismantle it. Large fragments of this protein survive the journey through your stomach entirely intact. They arrive at your small intestine undigested and ready to cause trouble. Human digestion is simply not equipped to fully break down these specific molecular chains. This ensures that every time gluten is consumed, these heavy, intact protein fragments will assault the lower digestive tract. In the small intestine, a secondary enzyme called DPP4 tries to finish the job. However, the volume of gliadin in a typical modern diet quickly overwhelms the limited supply of this enzyme. These fragments press against the intestinal wall, triggering the release of a molecule called zonulin. This molecule signals the protein structures that hold your intestinal cells together to pull apart, creating openings in what should be a solid barrier. In its healthy state, the lining of the gut is a dense forest of finger-shaped projections called villi, topped with even smaller microvilli. This architecture creates an enormous surface area, roughly 32 square meters, optimized for one purpose: absorption. Chronic exposure to gluten transforms this landscape. The villi become blunted, flattened, and stunted, creating an eroded landscape resembling a forest after a wildfire. This loss of surface area has immediate consequences. Iron and calcium absorption suffer, while critical nutrients like vitamin D and B12 slip past uncaptured. By hour 12, the environment begins to shift. With no new gluten entering the system, the supply of gliadin fragments dwindles. The signal to keep those junctions open begins to fade. This cessation of the zonulin signal is the crucial turning point. It creates the biological space necessary for the gut to stop its defensive posture and finally begin cellular repair. At the 24-hour mark, your small intestine is now, for the first time in perhaps months or years, completely free of the gliadin trigger. The repair begins immediately. Your intestinal lining replaces itself every 3 to 5 days, the fastest rate of cellular turnover in the human body. Without the constant assault of gliadin fragments, these new cells can successfully build tighter, stronger junctions. The gaps in the wall start to close, and the dam begins to hold. But by hour 48, many people report a surge in unpleasant symptoms. Bloating can increase. Cravings for pasta and bread intensify, leading to headaches and irritability. This happens because your gut microbiome is losing its primary fuel source. The bacterial communities that had adopted to a gluten-rich diet are now facing a sudden, massive deficit. This leads to a microbial reshuffling. Certain species decline rapidly, while others begin to multiply, creating temporary gas and digestive discomfort as the ecosystem searches for a new equilibrium. This intense physical discomfort is not a sign that you should go back to gluten. It is the chaotic, mandatory byproduct of an internal ecosystem violently recalibrating itself. By hour 72, zonulin levels drop measurably. This is the first turning point, where the signal forcing your intestinal junctions open hits a significant low. This allows tight junctions to firmly seal, halting the leakage of foreign particles into the bloodstream and stabilizing the barrier. Your immune system notices. With fewer false alarms, markers of systemic inflammation, like C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, begin to trend downward, allowing the immune system to stand down from a state of high alert. Simultaneously, a secondary benefit emerges. Beneficial gut bacteria, now fermenting fiber rather than processing wheat, begin to produce more short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. These molecules are critical. They feed the colon lining, strengthen the barrier from the inside, and send anti-inflammatory signals system-wide. The first 72 hours are the hardest. They are uncomfortable and confusing, but the invisible structural changes occurring beneath the surface are immense. This stabilized environment sets the stage for the next phase of recovery. Once the physical barrier is firm and inflammatory noise subsides, the gut begins talking to your brain in ways researchers are only beginning to understand. By day 7 without gluten, the intestinal lining completes a full cycle of cellular regeneration. New cells physically close the microscopic gaps in the wall. Fresh epithelial cells take over, and the protein zonulin, which modulates gut permeability, steadily declines. The tight junctions between these cells strengthen, sealing the bloodstream against undigested food particles. As the barrier is fortified, the persistent mental haze of difficulty concentrating and feeling sluggish after a meal begins to recede. This occurs via the gut-brain axis, a communication highway primarily utilizing the vagus nerve. This nerve stretches from the abdomen to the brainstem. When the gut is inflamed, it transmits continuous distress signals. As inflammation subsides, those signals stop. Simultaneously, specialized enterochromaffin cells in the intestinal lining resume normal function. These cells produce 90% of the body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter responsible for mood regulation and a sense of well-being. The mental clarity experienced in this first week results from clearing the static on the vagus nerve and restoring the serotonin supply to the brain. By day 10, the biological restoration extends to the vast ecosystem of intestinal bacteria. Based on research in gut microbes, removing gluten alters bacterial composition in 2 weeks. Beneficial species like bifidobacterium thrive on vegetables and unprocessed grains. Simultaneously, bacterial populations relying on gluten begin to starve and rapidly decline. This population shift changes how the body extracts energy from food and how the immune system identifies genuine threats. At the 14-day milestone, baseline energy levels stabilize, and the bloating typical of the first week's adjustment period drops significantly. These improvements are often dramatic for the estimated 1 to 13% of the population suffering from non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The healing process now reaches the body's largest organ, the skin. This diagram of the gut-skin axis illustrates how high intestinal permeability triggers external reactions. When inflammatory molecules escape the gut and enter the bloodstream, they travel to the skin layer. This mechanism is associated with chronic conditions like eczema, psoriasis, and unexplained rashes. The clearer skin reported by week 2 reflects a sealed intestinal wall and dropping systemic inflammation, which allows the immune system to stop reacting at the skin layer. On day 21, the small intestine shows structural recovery in the villi. These finger-shaped projections regain their density and architecture after years of blunting. They sway fluidly in the digestive tract, actively catching particles for absorption. Restored villi successfully capture nutrients like iron, calcium, and vitamin D that previously slipped past the damaged lining. We are interested in your results. Have you ever removed a specific food and noticed unexpected changes? Maybe better sleep, fewer headaches, or more energy? Let us know in the comments. By day 25, the body's immune defenses undergo a measurable recalibration. In celiac disease patients, blood tests show a downward trend in TTG antibodies. This decline indicates the immune system is standing down from its attack posture. For those without celiac, general inflammation markers like CRP and IL-6 follow a similar downward path. This reduced inflammatory burden frees up cellular resources, allowing the immune system to focus on identifying actual infections and abnormal cells. At day 30, the milestones converge. The gut barrier is repaired, the microbiome has shifted, the mind is clear, and the immune system has recalibrated. This multi-system restoration raises a final question. Is this lifestyle change worth the effort for everyone? Removing gluten can create severe nutrient gaps, often filled by a multi-billion-dollar industry producing processed alternatives that may not prioritize your long-term health. The biological restoration of the gut is significant, but it must be weighed against the challenges of navigating an industry that profits from these dietary shifts. 30 days without gluten is complete, but before we celebrate the physiological results, we need to have an honest conversation about the costs. Evaluating any intervention requires an accounting of its trade-offs rather than a reliance on marketing. Whole wheat, barley, and rye provide significant levels of dietary fiber, B vitamins, iron, and folate, nutrients that drive energy production and blood cell formation. When removing these grains without a structured plan, people often replace them with highly processed alternatives. These highly processed alternatives contain far less fiber, directly starving the essential SCFA-producing microbes responsible for maintaining your gut lining. A dietary change intended to heal the gut can, if executed poorly, starve the exact bacteria required to keep the system functioning. This chart shows the financial impact. Research reveals that gluten-free products carry an average price premium of 242%. A $6 gluten-free loaf sits next to a $2 wheat loaf. These premiums add thousands to an annual grocery bill. Then there is the psychological burden. Navigating menus at local restaurants, reading every single ingredient label, and questioning hosts at dinner parties requires constant, exhausting vigilance. For some, the stress and social isolation of a strict diet partially offsets the physiological benefits. Given these costs, who actually benefits biologically from 30 days without gluten? The evidence is strongest for the 1% of the population with confirmed celiac disease. For these individuals, gluten is a trigger for a full-scale immune attack that progressively destroys the villi of the small intestine. The next group includes those with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. These individuals often see measurable clinical improvements, like clearer thinking and more energy, once allergies have been ruled out. Then there are those who simply feel better. A 2018 study in the journal Gastroenterology found that in double-blind trials, many of these individuals could not reliably distinguish between gluten-containing and gluten-free meals. Their relief is real, but it may stem from broader changes, like eating more vegetables and fewer processed foods, rather than gluten avoidance itself. In the late 1990s, Alessio Fasano was at the University of Maryland studying cholera, a disease that kills primarily through one mechanism. The cholera bacterium produces a toxin called ZOT. Fasano's team wanted to know how this toxin breaches the body's defenses. The ZOT toxin forces open the tight junctions of the intestinal lining, causing the massive, uncontrolled fluid loss that makes the disease fatal. Fasano discovered that the human body produces its own version of this molecule to regulate intestinal permeability. He named it zonulin. While every human body produces zonulin, the most potent dietary trigger for its release is gliadin, a protein in gluten. This means everyday bread interacts with the same molecular mechanism that one of history's deadliest diseases uses to breach the gut barrier. This leads to 4 clinical rules. First, because whole grains provide significant benefits, removing them without cause may do more harm than good for the majority of the population. Second, if you suspect a sensitivity, use a structured 30-day removal period under clinical guidance to track symptoms consistently. Third, focus on naturally gluten-free whole foods like sweet potatoes and quinoa. Swapping wheat bread for processed gluten-free bread does not solve the underlying nutritional problem. This graph shows why you must get blood tests for TTG antibodies while still eating gluten. If you remove it first, antibody levels drop, often leading to a false negative result. Early elimination makes an accurate diagnosis much harder, leaving the root cause of your symptoms invisible to clinicians. The human gut is highly resilient, completely rebuilding its own internal cellular lining every few days to maintain a functional barrier. It hosts trillions of microorganisms that influence immunity and mood, and it produces the vast majority of your body's serotonin. It remains the most important physical barrier between the outside world and the inside of your body. Because the gut is our fundamental biological shield, what you choose to send through it determines the health of the entire system.